Okay, everybody, welcome back to the online video lecture series for Philosophy 102 Ethics. Today we're going to change direction a little bit because we have now completed our all of our lessons on utilitarianism. We've looked at all three of its components, consequentialism, hedonism, and the principle of equality, and we've seen some of the practical implications of those components. But in this lesson, like I said, we're going to change direction, and we're going to do that by looking at another moral theory which essentially is opposed and really contrary to utilitarianism on pretty much every single point. And that is the moral theory that we find in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And specifically, so what I'm going to try to accomplish in this video is I want to introduce some of the basic elements of Kant's moral theory with a real specific focus on his ideas of moral absolutism. And we're going to do that by looking at the preface to his most famous work on morality, which is the Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. But before we get there, I want to say a few preliminary points to sort of introduce this idea of moral absolutism, which forms the foundation of Kant's moral theory. And to do that, I want to look at the historical example of the decision of President Truman to use the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in order to end World War II. So what I'm interested in for the moment is the justification, or what Truman himself thought about this decision. So although Truman knew that the bombs would destroy entire cities full of innocent civilians, at the time Truman wrote in his diary, quote, "I have told the Secretary of War, Mr. Stimson, to use the bomb, so that military objectives and soldiers and sailors are the target and not women and children. The target will be a purely military one." And he later said that he slept like a baby after signing the order to use the bombs. Okay, so there are a number of things that one can think about this justification that he's giving here. One, given that the bombs were in fact dropped on cities that were full of civilians, it's very I'll put it this way, it's a bit of a stretch to think that Truman could have reasonably expected that the main target would be a military one. As we talked about in previous videos, the doctrine of double effect, for instance, does allow that you might have to take an action which has a unwanted or undesirable side effect. But when that side effect is extremely integral to the action, when the harm of that side effect is so horrible, even the doctrine of double effect would be a little put off here. And in fact, at the time, the main reason given for dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not arising from the doctrine of double effect. It was actually arising from a sort of consequentialist or utilitarian reasoning. The idea was that, well, we could engage in a land invasion of Japan, but overall that would cause more lives to be lost, and so the correct decision would be to use the atomic bombs. Now, there's a number of ways in which one might criticize this. One could actually be a utilitarian or consequentialist and say this is the wrong decision. Because we might say, well, are there other ways that we could have gone about ending the war that didn't involve dropping an atomic bomb? Just one possibility, for instance, we might say, well, why didn't we take the atomic bombs and first drop them in the ocean to show Japan we were serious, to show that we had this capability, and to force them to the negotiating table and surrender that way? That would be one possibility. Or you could say maybe the empirical evidence shows that the land invasion wouldn't cost as many lives as people thought. And people argue about that today. But the other possibility I want to consider, and the reason I'm bringing this up and why this matters for this lesson, is because there's another way to criticize Truman's decision. And in fact, you can see this criticism. So this is Elizabeth Anscombe. She was a famous moral philosopher in the 20th century. And here's what she said, and she was actually very much involved in protesting this decision to drop the atomic bomb. And this is what she said about the decision. "For men to choose to kill the innocent as a means to their ends is always murder. And murder is one of the worst human actions. So the prohibition on deliberately killing prisoners of war, or the civilian population, does not depend on its promulgation as part of positive law." And here's the critical part. So she said so far that Killing innocent people is always murder, murder is always wrong, and here's the way she put it quite forcefully. Come now, if you had to choose between boiling one baby and letting some frightful disaster befall 1,000 people, or 1,000,000 people if 1,000 is not enough, what would you do? And of course, the way she puts this is apt when she talks about boiling one baby, because as a matter of fact, when the atomic bombs were dropped, that sort of thing did happen, and it didn't just happen, of course, to one baby or one person. Now, it's important to understand the sort of criticism she's making. She's not making a consequentialist criticism. She isn't saying that, well, if you really understood the consequences properly, you would see that dropping the atomic bomb will not bring about the best consequences. She's saying, okay, let's assume for the sake of argument that dropping the atomic bomb would save more lives. Again, it's a controversial claim, but let's just assume it's true for the sake of argument. She's saying still in that case, it would be the wrong decision. In the hypothetical example she poses, she says, even if you could save 1,000 people or 1,000,000 people, it would be morally wrong to kill one innocent baby. Now, there's certainly a lot of emotional force behind this because, of course, the very thought of killing one innocent child is a horrific thing to consider. And it may very well be the case that even if in the abstract you thought it was the right thing to do, maybe you couldn't bring yourself to do it. And of course, the consequentialist would say something like this. The consequentialist would respond and say, look, if that was the situation I was in, if I was forced to choose between killing one innocent child and letting 1,000 or 1,000,000 people die, I would have to, the right thing to do would be to kill the innocent child, whether I could bring myself to do it or not. And if I could, it would of course be with great regret and great sorrow. But what Anscombe says is, no, this just shows that consequentialism isn't correct. Consequences do matter. Consequences are important for morality, but they're not the only thing that matters. Elizabeth Anscombe was a moral absolutist. She felt that there were certain moral rules, certain moral laws that could not be broken no matter what the consequences were. And one of those was the prohibition against murder. Now, this sort of outlook, which I'm calling moral absolutism, forms one part of the deontological moral theory that we associate, that comes from the work of Immanuel Kant. So here's Kant. He was a German philosopher writing in the 18th century. And the deontological moral approach that comes from his work is based on the Greek root word deon. And basically, so if you compare deontology to utilitarianism, I can give you a pretty simple, one-sentence, straightforward definition of utilitarianism. Do the action that creates the greatest happiness for the greatest number. It's not really quite that way with deontology. So it's really just best to summarize it in a general way. It's just an approach to ethics which emphasizes adhering to moral rules, for instance, like the rule against murder, which is what Anscombe was appealing to. So it's very important that we follow certain rules and that we perform our duty. Morality is less about calculating the consequences of our actions and more about asking, are the actions we're performing in themselves morally correct or morally acceptable? Now, when we look specifically at the deontological theory of Immanuel Kant, there are really two elements that we need to explain. The first one, and I've used this term a couple of times, is this idea of moral absolutism. And so Kant's ethics is characterized by this idea that certain moral rules, by their very essential nature, are the sorts of commands or obligations that have to be followed unconditionally. There are certain rules that he thought, don't murder, don't lie, for instance. That's one we'll be getting to later, which is more sort of a controversial claim, but Kant thought it was never morally acceptable to lie, no matter the consequences. And he thought morality was just like this. In fact, he thought for something to even count legitimately as a moral rule, it must be the sort of thing you think has to be followed unconditionally. So that's the first aspect of his theory. The second aspect of his theory, which I'll just sort of mention briefly now, but we're actually going to cover it in more detail next week, is an idea of respect for persons. So the idea that we should respect persons comes from a couple of different claims. So Kant thinks that there's something about human beings, and really rational beings, which makes us unlike anything else in the universe. Unlike any other being in the universe, there's something special about you as a rational being, a being with the ability to reason. And because you have that special ability, you have a special status. And because you have that special status, it implies that you need to be treated with respect. And Kant will have a whole account of what it means to show respect, but his basic idea is that if you're a person, it entitles you to a certain status, and you need to be shown respect in accordance with that status. Alright, so we're going to be covering respect for persons next week in the videos I'll do then, but for now I want to focus on moral absolutism. And to get a better idea of these two, of moral absolutism, and really its connection to respect for persons, I want to consider the following hypothetical situation. Okay, so imagine you're a district attorney in a town where a tragic murder of a young child has occurred. You have no leads on who committed the crime, but suspect the person has already left town and that you will not be able to catch the culprit. Emotions are running high and many people are extremely angry. Suppose for whatever reason you know that the citizens will soon riot unless someone is arrested for the crime, and that, if the riots occur, many people will be harmed and killed. You know that you could prevent the riots by arresting and charging one innocent person with a crime, and let's just say, for the sake of argument, this person's not particularly well liked by the other people in the town. And many people already suspect he is guilty, so he's really the ideal scapegoat here. So if you punish this person, nobody will find out that you punished an innocent individual, and so the question is, should you punish this innocent person with the crime? So let's think about the different options here. Again, a utilitarian or a consequentialist would have to say, well, look, let's add up the consequences of each choice. On the one hand, we can just not arrest this innocent person. Riots will ensue, property will be damaged, people's lives will be harmed, people will even be killed. Okay, so that's one option. And it's good that we didn't arrest, an innocent person, because that would have decreased that person's happiness. But it's also going to cause a lot of suffering in the rest of the town. And in comparison to just, arresting one innocent person, it seems like that is actually the bigger concern. If you're a utilitarian or consequentialist, it seems like in this hypothetical scenario, the right thing to do would be to arrest and convict an innocent person of a crime they didn't commit. But on the other hand, we also have certain intuitions about human rights or individual rights. You might say, okay, hypothetically, yes, the better consequences would be to arrest and convict an innocent person. But doesn't this person have certain rights? Isn't it a moral obligation that the state punish the guilty and only punish the guilty? Now, of course, the state can't be perfect in doing that, but the point is they're wrong when they don't. And that the state should always, as far as they can, try to only punish those who are guilty. And we can see how that intuition sort of involves both of the elements I just mentioned. It involves a moral absolutism, and it involves a respect for persons. The idea is that no matter what benefit would accrue if we punished an innocent person, there's an absolute moral prohibition against doing that. And you might ask why? Well, because all citizens, all people, have certain rights. And we disrespect someone if we just say, yeah, we're going to violate your rights for the good of the community. Doesn't that individual have some importance? Don't they deserve to be treated with fairness and respect? So I bring this example up because it shows how these two components interact. In large part, one of the reasons why there are certain absolute moral prohibitions is because those moral prohibitions are required to show the proper respect for persons. Alright, so those are some preliminary points about deontology and moral absolutism. Let's try to dive into Kant's text. Now, if you've done the reading, then you know that Kant can certainly be an extremely challenging writer. He's a great philosopher, many insightful things to say, but his writing, he's not necessarily known for being the clearest writer. So we're going to try to break this down and make it as simple and clear as I possibly can. So the first question you have to ask yourself, and to get an idea of what Kant is attempting to accomplish in the preface, you should ask yourself the question, how is an absolutist ethics possible? Because when we think about it, there's a certain way in which consequentialism seems to make more sense. I mean, the circumstances of life are constantly changing, we're always in new situations, and it's tempting to say, well, any moral rule you would say should be unbreakable. That just isn't a practical way of thinking about morality. Because when situations change, maybe the rules need to change too. So how could it be possible that we could think morality gives us absolute commands? For Kant, in order to understand this, we first need to understand what kind of science is ethics? What kind of discipline is ethics? And that's really one of the main things he's trying to accomplish in this preface. Now, he tells us at the very beginning that there's a traditional division of the sciences coming from ancient Greek philosophy into physics, ethics, and logic. Okay, now this might seem somewhat strange to us now, because when you say, well, how many sciences are there? You say, well, I mean, there's more than I can count. There is physics, but there's also chemistry and biology and zoology and et cetera, right? So a couple of points here. When Kant uses the word science, he's not just referring to like the empirical sciences, it includes that, but he's really talking about any way in which we pursue knowledge. And if you think about it, if you really wanted to be sort of as broad as you possibly could, there are in some sense 3 different types of knowledge we seek. So one would be logical. We want to know how are we supposed to reason, and this would include things like mathematics, really formal, abstract disciplines. We want to know things about the physical world, and this could be things we traditionally think of as physics, like what is the gravitational constant, but it could also be any other sort of science that studies the physical world, even something like psychology, insofar as your mind and how your brain works and our psychological dispositions are part of the physical world. So anything that falls into the physical world would be physics. And then ethics is everything about which we've been studying in this class, how we ought to live. So we have formal knowledge about how we should reason, physical knowledge about how bodies in the world move, whether those are atoms or those are human beings, and then questions about how we should live, how we should act. And so in this passage here, I'm going to break it down a little further in a minute. Kant has this classification of the different sciences. So here's that same passage. And so the first thing he tells us is that all rational cognition is either material and considers some object, or it's formal. Okay, so let's look at the first part of the graph here. What does he mean by rational cognition? Basically just any use of reason to gain knowledge. And the important thing to keep in mind is that for Kant, every single time we use our reason, what we're attempting to do is essentially discover some type of laws. And we'll see why that matters in a minute. Right, so whatever reason does, it discovers some sort of laws. There's different types of laws, as we'll see, but it's attempting to discover certain sorts of laws. Okay, so when we're doing this, when we're reasoning to figure out knowledge about the world, we're either talking about something that's purely formal or something that's material. Now, the right side of the graph, the material side, will be more important for us, but I'll say a few things just about the formal side. So the only science of the 3 which Kant says is concerned with something formal is logic. And why is this? Right, well, essentially what the logician does is study arguments. And so let's take a really easy, sort of straightforward example of a classic argument called a syllogism. P1, all men are mortal. P2, Socrates is a man. P3, Socrates is mortal. Now, what I just gave you is a very simple argument, and it's also a valid argument, and that's because it follows certain laws of inference. Right? There are certain ways that's correct to reason, ways in which the premises lead to the conclusion, and that argument follows one of those laws. Right? That's one of Aristotle's classic syllogisms. But see, we say, well, why is this formal? I mean, that argument had content. It talked about the concept of a man. It talked about Socrates. Well, consider this. Consider the following argument. All mammals are warm-blooded. Ryan is a mammal, therefore Ryan is warm-blooded. Now, this argument I gave you follows the exact same type of structure. We establish that there's some universal category. We say there's some particular thing that falls in the category. Therefore, it has the characteristic of that general category. Both of the two arguments I just gave you, one about Socrates and one about Ryan, the warm-blooded mammal, both of those follow the same laws of inference, but they have totally different content. And so when we say logic is a formal discipline, we just mean that it's not inherently tied to any content about the material world. Now, so let's compare that to the other side, the material side, which I said is going to be more of our concern. On the material side, we have physics, and then we have ethics. And both of these, of course, because they're a form of rational cognition, discover a certain kind of law. So if we're talking about physics, we're saying, okay, well, how do bodies in the universe move? And the laws according to which those bodies move, we call the laws of nature. So again, a gravitational constant would be a law of nature, right? Just the fundamental physical laws by which the universe operates. But what about on the ethical side? What sort of laws does ethics discover? Well, Kant tells us, and this is a very sort of odd phrase when you first think about it. He says on the material side, these laws are either laws of nature, which we just discussed, or these are laws of freedom. Ethics is the science which discovers laws of freedom. And this should be a very sort of odd concept at first. Because if you're thinking about, for instance, okay, what is the example, what is the sort of image in your mind of someone who's maybe the most perfectly free? One of the things you might think of for that individual is not someone who follows laws. You might think of someone who breaks the laws. Someone who's a rule breaker seems more free. They're not weighed down by the expectations of society. Or someone who tries to escape society by going to some uninhabited region where there is no government, there is no sort of overarching force to tell them what to do. At first it seems like law and freedom are opposites. But one thing you should think about is there any way in which a law of any sort can make you more free than you would have otherwise been? And there are a couple ways in which this is true. So one example would be, consider traffic laws, right? So traffic laws that say you have to stop at red lights, you have to you'll only turn left in the left turn lane, there's speed limits you have to follow, all these sorts of laws. Now, of course, these can be burdensome. Sometimes you're on the highway and the speed limit is 70 and you want to go 75 or 80. It's the middle of the night and you're like, oh, do I really have to wait for this red light, right? So there's, of course, ways that those laws can seem like burdens on your freedom. But on the other hand, imagine a world where we didn't have any traffic laws. Now, would you feel more free? Do you see yourself just driving on the open road, having a great time? Well, possibly, if there aren't other cars around. But if there are other cars around, what I foresee is a bunch of traffic accidents. I see people running into each other. I see crashes. I see death. I see destruction. In fact, I see someone just riddled with anxiety, not knowing what other cars on the road are going to do next. And so sometimes laws and restrictions can actually make us more free. And here's another example which probably relates a little more closely to what Kant's talking about. Because what's really important, what he thinks morality is, in some sense, is a set of laws that you give to yourself that make you more free. So here's an easy example. And this isn't like a moral law, but it just gets at this idea of how you can give yourself a law to make yourself more free than you would have been otherwise. So let's say you're struggling to eat healthy, and let's say specifically the thing that's bothering or troubling you and making this difficult is that you really have a love for sweets. And let's say that every day you take the bus home, and the normal way you walk home, you go right by a bakery, and, often 5-6 times a week, you stop in the bakery and you get something tasty to eat. Now, you might make it as a law for yourself, a rule for yourself. You say, you know what, I'm going to get off at the next bus stop, I'm going to walk a little longer, that'll give me a little more exercise, plus I won't go by the bakery on my way home. Now, this is a restriction, right? Because it's stopping you from doing what you immediately want to do in the moment. Immediately, what you want to do in the moment is take the shorter route home. You want to stop in the bakery and get the tasty cookie or cake that you've been craving. On the other hand, you also have more long-term desires. You have certain desires or goals that aren't just based on your immediate wants. You want to be healthier, you want to stay fit, etc., etc. And if you think about if we really imagine someone who just has this uncontrollable urge to stop in the bakery, I mean, think about that word uncontrollable. For those, if you're really struggling with that sort of thing, if you're struggling to avoid sweets when you know that you'd be better off if you were able to avoid sweets, then there's a certain sense in which you have lost control of yourself. It's not you that's in control, it's your desires for sweets or your desires for anything else that's controlling you in that instance. So how can you fight back at this? How can you regain control of your life? Well, you can give yourself certain rules and restrictions. You say, I'm going to follow these rules and restrictions. I'm going to gain back control. I'm going to put myself back on the path that I want to be on. So although at first the idea of law and freedom going together is very odd, there are examples where it makes sense. And ultimately what we're going to see is that Kant thinks ethics discovers the laws of freedom because being a morally good person, specifically following the moral law, is exactly what makes you free. And we'll have to explain why that is. I'll give some suggestions in this lesson. It'll become more clear hopefully as we go on, but that's the basic idea. Okay, so another way in which he characterizes the difference between the laws of nature and the laws of freedom, he says the first as laws according to which everything happens, the second as those according to which everything ought to happen. So he says the laws of nature are just laws that say, how does everything in the universe happen? What is the speed at which a physical body falls when it's unsupported? How is it that human beings act when they're in groups? The laws of nature just tell us this is how things in the universe happen. But the laws of freedom tell us how should everything happen? Or more specifically, how should rational beings act? How should their actions occur? So this brings back a distinction we talked about way in the beginning of the course, where we're saying the laws of nature are descriptive and the laws of freedom are normative. Now, one important point to consider here is that what sorts of objects follow which laws? Now first, it's really easy to think of examples of beings that only follow the laws of nature. Right, so your car only follows the law of nature, trees, tables and chairs and rocks, and essentially just any physical object solely follows the laws of nature. Now there's some other beings that it's sort of controversial. Kant had a sort of low or dim view of animals, as we saw in our previous lesson. You remember that I read you that quote from Kant in the video on are humans and animals morally equal? So we didn't have a super positive view of animals. So he actually thought animals only follow the laws of nature. He thought they only follow instinct without the ability to reason. He might have been wrong about that. But in any case, we can all come up with examples of beings that only follow the laws of nature. There's no deliberation, there's no reason. They just essentially work as they're programmed. A computer does that. Kant thought animals do that because of instinct. Now likewise, it would be more difficult, but suppose someone asked you, well, are there any beings that only follow the laws of freedom? Are there any beings that are just completely and utterly free? Because a rock and a computer is not free. It just does what it's programmed. And this is more difficult because it's likely there's really nothing that we come across every day that we would say is really totally and completely free, that isn't conditioned by the physical laws of nature of the universe. So the only real example you would be able to come up with would have to be something like, the concept of a divine being like God. Something completely outside of the physical universe that isn't subject to the physical laws of nature. And that would bring up a whole host of other questions, but it'd have to be something like that, right? Only a being like that would be truly and utterly and totally free and only follow the laws of freedom. Now, So the next question to ask, though, is there anything that partakes of both? Right? Is there any being, is there any individual that is both influenced by the laws of nature, but also under the sway of the laws of freedom? Now, Kant thought there was such an individual, such a being, and you might have guessed it's the human being, and more specifically, a rational being, a being with the ability to reason, but not just any part of a human being. Because he says these laws of freedom, they apply to the human being's will. Or I should put it this way. Well, let's read the whole passage, or this part. By contrast, natural as well as moral philosophy can each have its empirical part. Since the former must determine the laws of nature as an object of experience, the latter for the human being's will, insofar as is affected by nature. So, the human being's will is something that can be affected by nature. Let's explain that point. So, what is the human will? So this comes from a book by John Callanan, who has a commentary on Kant's Groundwork, and he explains the will as the following. The will is just our ability to form intentions to act. When I deliberate over what to do, that is, when I engage in practical reasoning, the outcome of that reasoning is an intention to perform an action. I may decide to go shopping, or stay in bed, or give all my money to charity, or become a professional thief. So anytime I use my reason to deliberate and think about different options, and then on the basis of that reasoning, form an intention to act a certain way, I've exercised my will. Okay, so for Kant, the human will is that part of us that is both affected by the laws of nature and the laws of freedom. Our human will, or our ability to make choices on the basis of reason and act on those choices, lies in between or is affected by both of these sorts of laws. Okay, now, why would we say that? Well, let's take a simple example. Actually, I'm gonna go here and then I'll come back to that point. So, when we talked about Aristotle earlier in this course, we discussed the situationist challenge, and I gave you some examples of how your behavior can be very heavily influenced by the environment you're in, or what you just did, or who you're with. It can affect, for instance, your the probability that you'll lie or help people, etc. So let's look at another example like that. And let's look at an example of cheating. So most modern research on cheating explores the subtle behavioral influences that form the noisy background to our daily choices. In a typical laboratory setup to measure cheating behavior, people are placed in a situation where they think their actions are anonymous and where there's no chance of getting caught. In reality, of course, what they do is observed. As it turns out, almost anyone will cheat when given even minor, consciously imperceptible behavioral cues. For instance, in a series of 3 experiments, a group of psychologists found that lighting could affect cheating. In one study, participants in a dimly lit room cheated more often than those in the lighter one. Okay, so this is very sort of strange, and this comes from this article in the New Yorker called Inside the Cheater's Mind, where the author discusses this example. Okay, so suppose that's true, right? This study suggests that your propensity to cheat depends on, are you in a dark room that isn't lit so well, or a light room? Now, what does that show you? Well, your decision to cheat is based on your will, right? So when you're taking the test in this case, and you're deciding should I cheat or not, you're going through a process of reasoning. You're saying, okay, I could cheat or I could not cheat. Here are the reasons to cheat. Here are the reasons not to cheat. And then you decide, and when you do that, you're using what Kant calls the will. And what this shows is that our will is subject to a lot of environmental factors. Just like a computer, just like a car, our will can be influenced by the physical environment around it. But at the same time, even though we know this is true, we know that our decisions, a lot of the decisions we make are influenced sort of in a causal way by the physical environment. We also have a sense of right and wrong. So that it's also possible, while we have certain aspects of our psychology that will push us to cheat or not cheat, we also have a sense that, you know what, cheating is the wrong thing to do. We also have a sense that although I might not choose to do the right thing, I know the right thing is not to cheat. And so although our will is influenced by the laws of nature, it's also influenced by the laws of freedom, by moral laws. Because we know the human will can also be motivated to make certain choices based on the fact that we know what's right or wrong. Now, so what does all this show us? It shows us that for Kant, the human being lies in a very sort of interesting area. Specifically, the human being or the rational being is much different than anything else you find in nature or any other sort of artifact that humans make or any other material object. And the late philosopher Roger Scruton, here's Roger Scruton, he died recently, just this year, not too long ago. He describes this point in the following way. He describes human beings as sitting on the edge of nature. So in a lecture he says, there's another thought that's helpful in describing the relationship between persons and their bodies. Why is he talking about that relationship? Insofar as you're a body, you're a physical thing, you're influenced by the laws of nature. But insofar as you're a person, you have the ability to think, to reason, to deliberate, namely you have a will. So this thought that he's going to explain was first given prominence by Kant. As a self-conscious subject, I have a point of view on the world. Okay, so because you have consciousness and you have a subjective point of view, he says you have a point of view on the world. Things happen and things seem a certain way to you. You have a unique perspective. And other individuals don't have that perspective. So there's something special about your consciousness, about your perspective. But notice that when you describe physical objects in the world, when you give it a scientific account of them, you don't think of those objects in that way. For instance, when you're describing how a car works, you don't presume that the car has its own point of view. You don't presume that there's something inside going on in the car's mind that's unique to them. You say, here, look, here's a physical rundown of how the car works. It's really available to anyone. This is an object which can be publicly understood by anyone who takes the time to learn about it. So Scruton says, when I give a scientific account of the world, however, I'm describing objects only. I'm describing the way things are and the causal laws that govern them. But when we describe other people, we don't suppose that. When you look at another person and you ask, well, how and why do they act the way they do, you suppose that person has a unique perspective, they have a unique set of reasons they're thinking about, they have a unique set of values and things they care about, and you don't describe them just in the way you would any other physical object, like a tree or a car. And so, what Scruton says is that the person or the subject lies on the edge of things, like a horizon that can never be grasped from the other side, the side of subjectivity itself. Now, why does he say that the human person, the subject, lies on the edge of things? Well, here's another quote from his recent book on human nature. And this peculiarity of the first-person knowledge means that for myself, I am not merely an object to be observed. I'm not something that is there in the order of nature, whose properties and conditions has to be worked out from its physical relation and so on. So he says, because you're a person, you're not just an object to be observed and studied and explained in a physical way. He says, I am, as it were, sitting on the edge of nature, of the natural world, a point of view upon it, but not an item within it. Human beings are on the edge of nature because on the one hand, we have instincts, and we follow the physical laws of nature, just like animals do, just like rocks do, just like computers and cars. On the other hand, we have a sense of morality. We're also able to follow the laws of freedom. So we are at once like part of the physical world, but also not like anything, but also unlike anything else you'll find in it. And so we're on the edge of nature. Now look, some people would say the human being is just merely another animal. that you could explain human behavior just as you would explain a car, or you explain the behavior of a dog, or anything else if you had enough information. But Kant is not proceeding on that sort of assumption. Kant thinks that, in fact, there is something which separates human beings or rational beings from the rest of the natural world. What that thing is our will, and this ultimately is why Kant thinks that human persons deserve respect. Okay. Now, because this is the case, so of course, our will is influenced by our environment, our psychology, our history, all that stuff. Kant doesn't deny that. But if we want to discover the laws of freedom, he says, if we want to discover moral laws, we can't just look at those sorts of considerations. So, for instance, for Kant, it would be ridiculous to say, well, historically, this is what my religious community, my social community, my peer group has always believed is the right thing to do. Therefore, this in fact is the right thing to do. Well, now, why couldn't that be the approach? Well, there's a couple reasons. One, Kant's a moral absolutist who think the same rules apply to everyone. But that would imply that different peer groups, different religious, cultural, social communities would each have their own moral rules. Or you might say, well, look, I am a sort of person who is just more likely to cheat. That's just how my psychology is set up for whatever biological or social or environmental reason. So therefore, cheating is okay for me. Well, no, that's not going to work. Because again, these moral rules are supposed to apply equally to everyone. So Kant says in the preface, I limit the question presented just to this. Is it not thought to be of the utmost necessity to work out for once a pure moral philosophy, completely cleansed of everything that might be in some way empirical and belongs to anthropology? So he wants to have this pure moral philosophy. And what does that mean? Well, Kant certainly admits that our history, our traditions, our psychology, our human nature, the authority figures we care about in our religious traditions, these all influence the way we act. But when we're thinking about how do we know what the moral rules are, how do we know what the laws of freedom are, they shouldn't come from any of these things. Because these are different for different individuals. These are just empirical matters. These would apply to the laws of nature. But morality is something else. It's a set of laws of freedom. And so he says, I'm going to work out this pure moral philosophy that isn't based on any of these considerations. And he says if you take that seriously, and this is probably one of the most important paragraphs from the preface, it really gets at the idea of what Kant thinks morality is all about. And so we say, okay, we want a pure moral philosophy that applies to everyone, that isn't just drawn from our traditions and our psychology, etc. And he says the idea that we need a pure moral philosophy is clear if you just consider the common idea of what we all believe morality to be. So here's the passage. For that there must be such a pure moral philosophy is clear from the common idea of duty and of moral laws. Everyone must admit that a law, if it is to hold morally, as a ground of obligation, must carry with it absolute necessity. That the command, thou shalt not lie, does not just hold for human beings only, as if other rational beings did not have to heed it. And so with all remaining actual moral laws, hence that the ground of obligation here must not be sought in the nature of the human being or in the circumstance of the world in which he's placed, but solely in concepts of pure reason. So he's saying, look, the command, thou shalt not lie. When we hear that command, what do we think? If you just ask yourself, what do you think that means? Does it mean don't lie unless it would be helpful to you? Does it mean don't lie unless you really want to? Does it mean just don't lie if you feel like it, or don't lie sometimes? He says, no, if this is really a moral command, then what it means is don't lie ever. What it means is it doesn't matter what circumstances of the world you find yourself in. If that's really a moral law, if it's really a moral rule, then it always has to be followed. And in fact, if we didn't think that the idea that you shouldn't lie always had to be followed, well, there's a better word for that. Not a moral law, but a practical rule. He says at the end, any other prescription that is founded on the principles of mere experience can indeed be called a practical rule, but never a moral law. If we could just choose when we wanted to lie or not lie, then you might say, okay, don't lie, that's a helpful rule of thumb, it's a helpful rule to keep in mind, it's a good guideline. Don't always follow it, of course, but yeah, it's a good guideline for your life. But if moral rules are not just guidelines, if they're commands that we are obligated to follow, and then we can't just choose not to follow, then in fact, thou shalt not lie must have a more substantive or forceful obligation for us. And in fact, for Kant, for any rule to even qualify as a moral law, it has to meet two conditions. It must be the sort of rule or law that you think every single rational being must follow. Notice in this passage up here he says that the command thou shalt not lie does not just hold for human beings only, as if other rational beings did not have to heed it. What other rational beings is he referring to? Well, Kant doesn't really think animals are fully rational beings, so presumably the best example would be, if there are alien beings on other planets who can also reason, who have consciousness, who importantly have a will, then if thou shalt not lie is a moral rule, not only do we human beings on earth have to follow it, but they would have to follow it as well. Moral rules are rules that apply to every single being with reason. And secondly, not only are moral rules required for all rational beings, they must also be required in all conceivable circumstances. They aren't conditional, right? It's not such that, don't lie unless it would make the other person feel bad, or don't lie unless, telling the truth will bring about a lot of harm. No. If it's a moral rule, it always has to be followed. And that really is the foundation of Kant's moral absolutism. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Hopefully we have some sense of the foundation of Kant's ethics and his moral absolutism. As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.